Sure, sir. Identification, now.
I was verified through TSA and boarding. I can cooperate through a private verification process.
No, you're refusing a lawful request. That's suspicious.
I'm not refusing verification. I'm refusing to display sensitive credentials in a cabin.
Stand up. You're coming off this plane.
I'm federal. Forcing this in public.
Picture this: a man is already seated on a packed morning flight, seatbelt fastened, phone on airplane mode, just like every other passenger waiting for departure. Then a flight attendant stops at his row, leans in, and asks for identification. Before he can respond, an airport police officer steps forward and repeats the demand, louder, as if issuing an order. The man stays calm. Hands visible. He explains that his identity was already verified through TSA screening and the boarding process. He adds that pulling out sensitive credentials in public could compromise an ongoing federal operation. He offers alternative verification methods, the kind professionals use to solve problems discreetly. The officer treats his calm refusal like a confession. He tells the man he's acting suspicious. He warns that he could be removed from the plane. Passengers stop pretending they aren't listening. Heads turn. Phones tilt upward as people try to record without being obvious. What started as a routine flight is now a public power struggle in a cramped aisle with nowhere to escape. Quick question: where are you watching from today? Drop your state or country in the comments. And if you appreciate stories about people staying calm while authority pushes too far, hit like and subscribe, because these situations get expensive when ego takes control. Now let's rewind to how this started, because it didn't begin with chaos. It began with one decision to escalate something that should have stayed discreet. The man was Special Agent Marcus Reed, an undercover FBI agent traveling under a cover identity tied to a long-running case. He wasn't on that flight for convenience. He was there because of a scheduled meeting connected to an operation that depended on timing and staying unnoticed. He had already passed every normal airport checkpoint. TSA verified his identity at screening. He cleared security. His boarding pass scanned and matched the manifest at the gate. He boarded and sat down like every other passenger. That's why this confrontation mattered. The system had already done its job. So when someone came back for a second ID check after boarding, it usually meant someone reported a concern without hard evidence. That's the moment where judgment matters most. Before the cabin door closed, a flight attendant walked down the aisle and stopped at Reed's seat. She didn't say he'd threatened anyone. She didn't say his ticket didn't match. She didn't mention an emergency. She said she needed to confirm his identity again. Reed explained that he'd already been verified through TSA and boarding. He said he could cooperate through the airline's process if needed, but he couldn't expose sensitive credentials in a cabin full of strangers. He pushed for a private solution, verify him through proper channels, not in front of passengers. The flight attendant didn't resolve it. She stepped back and signaled for airport police. An officer boarded and came straight to Reed's row. No quiet check near the front. No pulling him aside first. The officer positioned himself in the aisle so everyone nearby could see who had control. The officer demanded ID. Reed repeated the same thing. He was already verified through the airport process. He could be verified again the right way, but he could not pull out sensitive credentials in public without compromising an operation. This is where the power struggle began. The officer didn't ask, "How do we verify this safely?" He treated it as, "You're going to do what I say." He labeled Reed's refusal as suspicious. He framed it like Reed was dodging identification. He raised the consequences out loud so everyone could hear: comply or get removed. That public framing mattered. Once it's said in front of passengers, backing down feels like losing. And some people would rather be wrong than look wrong. Passengers started recording, some openly, some discreetly. Either way, the atmosphere shifted. Once cameras are involved, every move becomes evidence and every tone becomes part of the record. Reed stayed in his seat. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't get pulled into the officer's tempo. He kept repeating the same point: verify him through official channels, not in the cabin. The officer signaled toward the door and called for backup. Right there, Reed understood where this was heading. The officer wasn't trying to verify him anymore, he was trying to force a public win. Backup arrived fast. 2 more airport officers stepped into the aisle. Now Reed wasn't dealing with one person demanding ID, he was dealing with a small team standing over him while the cabin watched. And the officer made sure the cabin watched. He kept the conversation loud enough for nearby rows to hear. He kept repeating the same framing: refusal equals suspicious. He made it sound like Reed was trying to bypass a basic rule. He ignored the part where Reed had already cleared TSA and boarded like everyone else. This is how public authority works when it's handled badly. The goal shifts from solving the issue to winning the moment. The flight attendant stayed close but stopped leading. The airline supervisor appeared near the front, looking like she wanted this finished quickly. Nobody wanted to be the person who told the officer to slow down. That's the uncomfortable truth. In real situations, bystanders and staff often freeze when someone in uniform takes over, even when that person is clearly escalating. Reed kept repeating the same offer: verify him through proper channels, privately. He didn't say he wouldn't be verified. He said he wouldn't expose sensitive credentials in the cabin. The officer treated private verification like an excuse. He ordered Reed to stand and hand over identification immediately. Reed didn't stand right away. He stayed seated and kept saying the same thing, because standing up into an officer who's already keyed up is how a simple moment turns into resisting on a report. Phones were up now, not just one or two, but multiple. People weren't even trying to hide it. At that point, Reed made a decision he'd been trying to avoid because it was the most dangerous option in a public place. He disclosed that he was federal. Not details, not a speech, just the status and the warning. He was in the middle of a long-running case, and forcing him to expose credentials publicly could burn the operation. That should have been the moment the officer chose discretion. Instead, the officer treated it like a lie. He dismissed the claim as fake. He doubled down in front of the cabin and leaned into the "nobody is above the rules" line, like it was the only thing that mattered. He wasn't thinking about federal operations. He wasn't thinking about risk. He was thinking about being challenged in public and not backing down. And when someone is that committed to being right, the evidence stops mattering. The officer told Reed he was being detained. He ordered him out of the seat. Reed stood up slowly, hands visible, no sudden moves. He didn't argue for the crowd. He didn't try to win the aisle. He just complied with the physical direction while still refusing to expose sensitive credentials in public. That still wasn't enough for the officer. The officer cuffed him. That was the moment the cabin fully changed, because once cuffs are on, everyone watching stops thinking misunderstanding. Now it looks like an arrest, and everyone's brain starts building a story around it. Reed was walked up the aisle in handcuffs while passengers recorded. Some people muttered. Some protested. Most just filmed and stared. On the jet bridge, the officer kept control tight. Reed kept repeating one point: this didn't need to be public, and there were proper ways to verify him. The officer kept treating every word like another attempt to dodge. Reed was taken into an airport police office and held while the officer started writing the incident as refusal and suspicion. That paperwork mattered because the officer was building his justification, trying to lock in his narrative before anyone with higher authority got involved. Here's the part that hit hardest. Reed's cover didn't get burned because he showed a badge. It got burned because the arrest was public. His face was on video. The scene was going to spread. And once something like that spreads, people start connecting dots. Even if they don't know his real name, they know his face, his airline, his route, the date, the flight number. That's enough for the wrong person to start asking questions. Within hours, federal supervisors were on the phone, forcing confirmation through channels the officer couldn't ignore. The truth came back clean: Reed was exactly what he said he was. But by then, the damage wasn't reversible. Because while the officer was trying to prove a point, the FBI team running Reed's case had to make a decision based on risk, not pride. And the safest decision was brutal. Abort the operation before the exposure got someone hurt. The FBI didn't treat what happened as a bad interaction. They treated it as an exposure event. Because once Reed was cuffed and walked off a plane in front of a cabin full of phones, the operation wasn't just at risk, it was compromised. That's the part the officer never understood. Reed didn't need his real name leaked for things to go wrong. All it took was a public scene tied to a date, an airport, a flight, and a face. Within hours, the video started circulating. First as a shaky clip with no context, then with captions, then with people stitching in commentary, then with passengers posting their own angles. Some people framed Reed as a problem because they only saw refused ID. Others pointed out the obvious: he had already passed TSA and boarded, and the officer escalated it into a public arrest. This is what always happens when authority overreaches in a confined space: it becomes a debate online before the paperwork is even finished. Behind the scenes, Reed's supervisor was already in containment mode. The federal team running the case started making calls that had nothing to do with defending Reed's pride and everything to do with protecting the investigation. They pulled contacts. They paused meetings. They changed locations. They started treating every planned movement as compromised. And then came the hard decision. The operation was aborted. That's not a dramatic announcement. It's a quiet shutdown that looks like nothing to the public but costs months of work. Informants get spooked. Targets go dark. People who were finally talking stop answering. The chain breaks, and rebuilding it can take years, if it's even possible again. Meanwhile, at the airport, the local department tried to hold the line. The officer's report framed Reed as suspicious and non-compliant. It leaned on the simplest narrative: the officer asked for ID, and the passenger refused. It avoided the part where Reed offered private verification options. It avoided the part where Reed stated federal status. And it definitely avoided the part where the arrest happened inside a plane full of witnesses. But witnesses are the problem with that kind of report. Multiple passengers gave statements. Some confirmed the officer escalated quickly. Some confirmed Reed repeatedly offered verification through proper channels. Some confirmed the officer dismissed Reed's federal claim without checking. And of course, the videos backed up the core issue: this wasn't a safety emergency. This was an ego situation that turned into a public arrest. Once federal confirmation came through, the department couldn't pretend they'd caught someone dangerous. They had detained a verified federal agent who was traveling for work, and they had done it in the loudest way possible. That's when oversight kicked in. Airport administration wanted answers because the incident delayed operations. The airline wanted distance because the cabin footage made them look complicit. The city's legal team wanted details because once a false arrest becomes public with video, the next step is predictable. And Reed wasn't just annoyed, he was damaged professionally. His cover identity was now tied to a viral confrontation. His face was now linked to an incident involving law enforcement. His travel was now something strangers could track backward. The FBI had to assume the wrong people could find that video. And in long-running cases, assume is enough to shut everything down. A formal review started moving. Internal affairs at the department. Airport police leadership. City attorneys. Federal legal staff on Reed's side documenting everything: the timeline, the verification already completed, the refusal to use private verification options, the escalation, the arrest, and the operational harm. Then came the ruling. The arrest was improper. Not unfortunate. Not miscommunication. Improper. That ruling mattered because it set the tone for what came next. Once it's documented that the detention and arrest were unjustified, the question becomes, how much is it going to cost, and who's going to be left holding the bill? The city got hit with a civil rights lawsuit. It wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about unlawful detention, misuse of authority, obvious failure to use reasonable verification methods when they were offered. It also highlighted something departments hate seeing in writing: the escalation happened publicly and unnecessarily, and the officer ignored safer options because he wanted compliance on his terms. And while the lawsuit moved forward, the public pressure didn't stop. News outlets picked it up because it had everything: a plane, an arrest, video, and a confirmed federal agent. Commentators argued about rules versus judgment. Regular people asked a simpler question: why didn't the officer just verify quietly instead of turning the cabin into a stage? The department tried to control the story at first: standard statements, "We take it seriously. We're reviewing." But the video made those statements weak because the public could see the escalation with their own eyes. And the more attention it got, the harder it became to protect the officer. Because now it wasn't just about one arrest. It was about training, supervision, and whether this kind of behavior was tolerated until it finally became expensive. Once the arrest was ruled improper, everything moved from incident to liability. The city's attorneys didn't want a drawn-out public trial with multiple passenger videos, a verified federal agent, and an officer on record dismissing private verification options. That's the kind of case where every bad decision gets replayed, slowed down, and explained to a jury. So the lawsuit didn't stay theoretical for long. The number attached to it, $2 million. And here's what made it worse than the money: the case wasn't complicated. It didn't require expert debate about split-second danger. It was about basic judgment. The passenger had already cleared TSA and boarded. He offered ways to verify privately. The officer escalated in the cabin anyway. The officer dismissed a federal claim without checking. The arrest was public, recorded, and avoidable. The arrest forced a federal operation to shut down. When the department tried to defend the officer at first, that support didn't last, because once federal confirmation was documented and the video spread, backing the officer meant backing the idea that an officer could ignore safer options, create a public scene, and then justify it as rules. Leadership shifted fast. Internal findings focused on the officer's decisions, not Reed's behavior. The reports emphasized escalation, failure to use available verification channels, unnecessary public detention. Then came the career part. The officer was fired. Not suspended. Not reassigned. Fired. And it wasn't framed as a technicality. It was framed as conduct and judgment, turning a manageable situation into a public arrest, ignoring alternatives, and exposing the city to major liability. The department also had to deal with what departments hate most: policy changes forced by embarrassment. New procedures were rolled out at the airport. The goal was simple: stop this exact scenario from happening again. The new rules were built around common sense that should have been used the first time. If a passenger is already screened and boarded, additional ID checks require a clear reason and a supervisor. If a passenger claims federal status or sensitive credentials, officers must use a private verification process instead of demanding documents in public. De-escalation steps are mandatory before detention on an aircraft unless there's an immediate threat. Any attempt to remove or arrest a passenger must be documented with specific facts, not just refused, because refused isn't a reason by itself when a person is offering verification another way. That's the whole lesson. On the FBI side, Reed didn't get a victory lap. He got a closed case file. The operation he was traveling for didn't restart. The targets went quiet. The contact chain broke. The months of work didn't come back just because the city paid money later. Reed was reassigned, not as punishment, but because his cover was unusable. And that's the part people miss when they only focus on the lawsuit number. The officer lost his job. The city lost $2 million. But the real cost was the mission that got burned for no good reason. And all of it started because someone wanted compliance in public more than they wanted a correct outcome in private. Rules matter. Verification matters. Safety matters. But when authority gets used like a stage performance, it stops being about safety and starts being about ego. And ego is expensive. So let me ask you, if you were a passenger watching that go down, what would you have done? Would you record? Would you speak up? Would you stay silent and let it play out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories where accountability shows up, even when it takes time.